In 2015, a team of geneticists drew a map of Britain using nothing but DNA. No roads, no county lines, no historical records. When they finished, an invisible border appeared, running along a small river in the southwest of England, separating one group of people from their neighbours almost as sharply as an international frontier. That border wasn't new. It was already there, marked on ordinary road maps called the River Tamar. What the scientists had just discovered, completely by accident, was that Cornwall's ancient boundary wasn't just a line drawn by mapmakers. It was written into the genes of the people living on either side of it. Cornwall has always insisted it's different. It has its own flag, black with a white cross, said to belong to the county's patron saint. It has its own language, Cornish, a Celtic tongue closely related to Welsh and Breton, spoken for centuries before nearly dying out and being deliberately revived in modern times. It has its own folklore, its own mining history, its own deep-rooted sense of being a nation rather than simply another English county that happens to stick out into the Atlantic. For a long time, most of that identity rested on culture, pride, and history, the kind of thing outsiders could politely dismiss as romantic branding for tourists. Then, in 2015, science stepped in and, almost by accident, confirmed that at least part of the story was written directly into human biology. The discovery came from a project called People of the British Isles, funded by the Wellcome Trust and led by researchers at Oxford University and University College London. Their method was deceptively simple but genuinely clever. Rather than testing anyone with DNA from anywhere, they specifically recruited around 2,000 volunteers whose full grandparents had all been born within about 80 kilometers of each other. That single requirement mattered enormously. It meant the researchers were sampling something close to a snapshot of Britain's population as it existed before the 20th century scrambled everything, before cars, motorways, and mass internal migration made it completely normal for someone's grandparents to have been born in 4 entirely different parts of the country. By focusing on people with genuinely deep local roots, the team could look past a century of modern mixing and see the older genetic patterns still sitting underneath. What they found, once the data was analysed, was extraordinary. Using nothing but subtle statistical similarities in DNA, the researchers were able to sort the entire sample into 17 genetically distinct clusters. And when they plotted those 17 clusters onto an actual map of Britain, the correlation with real geography was almost eerie. People with similar DNA tended to live near each other in patterns that matched historic kingdoms, regional boundaries, and old cultural divisions far more closely than anyone had expected. Modern, mixed, thoroughly migrated Britain still could. It was, in the researchers' own words, essentially a genetic map of the British Isles, hiding in plain sight the entire time, simply waiting for someone with the right tools to read it. Cornwall's result was one of the sharpest and most talked about findings in the entire study. The data showed a clear, well-defined genetic cluster covering Cornwall, separated distinctly from the neighbouring county of Devon. And the dividing line between the two wasn't vague or gradual. It followed almost exactly the same route as the modern administrative boundary between Cornwall and Devon, running along Bodmin Moor and the River Tamar. In practical terms, that meant if you picked 2 people at random, one from a village just west of the Tamar, and one from a village just east of it, purely on the basis of their DNA, a computer could tell you which side of that river their ancestors most likely came from, with striking accuracy, even though nothing about the river itself is any kind of physical barrier to people simply walking or driving across it. So why would a modest river in the southwest of England leave that kind of mark on human genetics? The answer goes back well over 1,000 years, to the slow, uneven spread of Anglo-Saxon settlement across post-Roman Britain. After the Roman withdrawal in the early 5th century, waves of Anglo-Saxon migrants and settlers gradually expanded westward out of what's now eastern England, absorbing local Brittonic-speaking kingdoms as they went. Devon, then part of a larger British kingdom called Dumnonia, was steadily brought under Anglo-Saxon control over the following centuries. Cornwall held out considerably longer. It remained a distinct, Brittonic-speaking territory long after most of what's now England had been absorbed into Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And it wasn't until the 10th century, traditionally dated to around 936 AD under King Athelstan, that the border between Cornwall and the rest of the emerging English kingdom was formally fixed at the River Tamar. The military reality behind that political decision was considerably messier and considerably more drawn out than a single tidy treaty. The old British kingdom of Dumnonia, which originally covered both Devon and Cornwall together, survived largely intact until the early 8th century, when eastern Devon finally fell under the control of the growing Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex. Even after that, the fighting didn't stop, it just kept moving further west. In 815, King Egbert of Wessex led a campaign described in contemporary accounts as raiding Cornwall from east to west, almost certainly aimed at finishing off Dumnonian resistance in the remaining Western Territory and seizing control of its valuable ports, metalworking skill, and trade contacts. Cornish resistance didn't end there either. In 838, at a place called Hingston Down, a combined army of Cornish fighters and Viking allies met Egbert's West Saxon forces in open battle in what turned out to be the last major recorded clash between an independent Cornish force and the expanding English kingdom. The Cornish and their Viking allies lost. That defeat effectively drew a line under roughly a century of intermittent warfare, stretching back to an earlier battle at Longborth in 710, and from that point on, Cornwall was absorbed into the growing Wessex Empire, politically at least. Even so, full administrative absorption was one thing, and everyday intermarriage was clearly another, because it would still be nearly 100 years later, under Athelstan around 936, that the border was formally fixed at the Tamar, and, as the genetics would eventually show, many more centuries after that before the population on either side of that river started to genuinely resemble each other. That single, gradually hardened political and military boundary, born out of over a century of resistance rather than a single clean decision, appears to have shaped the genetic makeup of the region ever since. Because Anglo-Saxon settlers and their descendants moved into Devon in far greater numbers and considerably earlier than they did into Cornwall, Devon's population absorbed a noticeably higher share of Anglo-Saxon ancestry. Across most of central, southern and eastern England, the Anglo-Saxon genetic contribution sits somewhere between roughly 10 and 40% of the total ancestry mix. Cornwall's contribution measures distinctly lower, consistent with a population that continued marrying largely within its own community, for centuries after the rest of southern Britain had already been absorbed into a new, mixed Anglo-Saxon and British population. The border on the map and the border in the DNA turned out to be telling the exact same story, just in two completely different languages. Here's where the study delivered its most genuinely surprising twist, the part that upended a popular assumption most people never think to question. For generations, Celtic has been treated almost like a single ethnic or genetic category, an ancient people supposedly stretching in an unbroken line across Ireland, Scotland, Wales and Cornwall, all descended from the same ancient stock, all genetically united by their shared Celtic language. Heritage. The 2015 study found almost the opposite. Genetically speaking, there is no single unified Celtic population at all. Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Cornwall are all clearly, measurably distinct from one another, in some cases among the most genetically different regional groups found anywhere in the entire study. And more surprising still, the Cornish turned out to be genetically closer to the English population of nearby Devon and the rest of southern England than they are to the Welsh or the Scots. Despite Cornwall sharing a Celtic language family with Wales, and despite centuries of cultural and political solidarity between Britain's Celtic nations. In other words, the thing that makes Cornwall, Wales, Scotland and Ireland feel connected today. Language, folklore, a shared sense of being distinctly non-English was never really a matter of shared ancestry in the genetic sense. It's a shared cultural and linguistic inheritance built up over centuries of contact, trade, and common history, layered on top of populations that were, in strictly biological terms, already quite different from each other long before anyone called any of them Celtic at all. The researchers found the same pattern of surprising fragmentation almost everywhere else they looked too, not just in Cornwall. Wales alone split into several separate genetic subclusters rather than forming one uniform Welsh group, hinting at old internal divisions within Wales itself that modern national identity has since smoothed over. Orkney, off the northern tip of Scotland, showed a genetic signature clearly influenced by Norse settlement, a lasting fingerprint from Viking-era contact that set it apart from both the rest of Scotland and from Scandinavia itself. And in one of the more quietly fascinating results, parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland showed closer genetic relationships to each other than to some of their more immediate neighbours, a pattern that lines up neatly with centuries of recorded migration back and forth across the narrow stretch of sea separating the two. None of these patterns respect the tidy modern national labels people use today. They respect something older and messier. Who actually settled where, who traded with whom, and which population stayed relatively isolated for long enough that their descendants, 1,000 years later, still carry a detectable trace of it. To understand where Cornwall's own distinct genetic signature actually comes from, you have to go back much further than the Anglo-Saxons, all the way to the Bronze Age, and to one of the most dramatic population changes in the entire history of the British Isles. Around 2500 BC, a wave of migrants associated with what archaeologists call the Bell-Beaker culture arrived in Britain from continental Europe, most likely travelling from the area around the Rhine and the Netherlands. Genetic analysis of ancient skeletons has shown these newcomers carried substantial amounts of what's known as steppe ancestry, tracing back further still to nomadic populations from the Eurasian steppe, and their arrival triggered an almost complete genetic turnover across Britain. Within a few hundred years, these Beaker-associated migrants and their descendants had replaced an estimated 90% or more of the previous Neolithic population's genetic makeup. One of the most rapid and thorough population replacements found anywhere in ancient European genetics. And Cornwall sat right at the centre of why these people came to Britain in such numbers in the first place. Cornwall holds some of the richest tin deposits in the whole of Europe, and tin, combined with copper, was the essential ingredient in bronze, the defining technology of the entire age. Tin extraction in Cornwall is believed to have begun around 2100 BC, almost exactly matching the arrival of Beaker populations and their metalworking knowledge. For the following centuries, traders travelled enormous distances specifically to reach Cornwall's tin sources, including seafarers from as far away as Iberia, bringing their own genetic contributions into the local population along established trade routes that connected Cornwall to the wider Bronze Age Mediterranean world. That reputation eventually travelled all the way to the ancient Mediterranean world, even if the exact location stayed a closely guarded secret for centuries. Classical Greek and Roman writers told stories of a mysterious tin-producing land far to the north called the Cassiterides, literally the Tin Islands, a name modern scholars overwhelmingly believe referred to Cornwall and the nearby Scilly Isles. Phoenician and Carthaginian merchants are widely credited with controlling this trade route during the first millennium BC, and by most ancient accounts, they guarded the exact location jealously, refusing to reveal it to rival traders, which is likely why the Greek historian Herodotus openly doubted the islands even existed at all. It took a Greek explorer named Pytheas, sailing from the colony of Massalia sometime around 325 BC, to actually reach the source directly, describing tin miners working near a headland called Belerium, almost certainly modern-day Land's End, and a nearby trading depot where the metal was gathered, before being shipped onward across the sea. In other words, Cornwall had already built a genuine international reputation and international trade connections roughly 2,300 years before anyone in an Oxford genetics lab ever thought to test a single local grandparent's DNA. Long before the Romans ever set foot in Britain, and long before a single Anglo-Saxon ship crossed the North Sea, Cornwall's population was already being shaped by international contact, all because of what was sitting underneath its own soil. Language tells a strikingly similar story of near loss and quiet survival, running on its own separate track alongside the genetics. Cornish remained the everyday spoken language for most of the local population for close to 1,000 years after the Anglo-Saxon border was fixed at the Tamar. Its decline accelerated sharply from the 16th century onward, not helped by the fact that the Book of Common Prayer was never officially printed in Cornish, unlike Welsh, leaving churchgoers to worship in a language many of them didn't fully speak. Dorothy Pentrith, generally known as Dolly Pentrith, who died in 1777, is popularly remembered as the last fluent native speaker of traditional Cornish, though language historians now know at least a handful of other speakers, including a man named John Davy, who died in 1891, likely outlived her. Either way, by the end of the 19th century, spoken Cornish had effectively gone silent as a first language. It didn't stay silent. In 1904, a scholar named Henry Jenner published a handbook aimed at deliberately reviving the language from historical texts and records, kicking off a revival movement that has continued, gradually gathering momentum into the 21st century through community classes, school programs, and renewed cultural pride. Today, researchers estimate somewhere in the region of 500 to 600 fluent Cornish speakers, alongside several thousand more people with at least a basic conversational grasp of the language, a modest number by any global standard, but a genuinely remarkable comeback for a language that many assumed had died out entirely more than a century ago. All of this ancient and medieval history eventually collided with modern politics in a way that gave Cornwall's distinct identity an entirely new official status. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland had all long been formally recognised under the Council of Europe's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, a treaty designed to protect the cultural rights of distinct peoples living within larger states. Cornwall was not. Campaigners had been pushing for the same recognition since 1999, arguing that Cornwall's language, history, and cultural identity deserved exactly the same protected status already granted to Britain's other Celtic nations. For 15 years, that campaign went nowhere. Then, on the 24th of April 2014, the UK government finally reversed course and formally recognised the Cornish as a national minority, granting them, in the government's own words, the same status as the UK's other Celtic people, the Scots, the Welsh, and the Irish. That recognition guarantees Cornish people specific rights to express, preserve, and develop their distinct culture and identity, with the UK's compliance monitored by the Council of Europe through regular reporting every 5 years. It's a striking sequence of events when you line up the timeline. Cultural campaigners spent 15 years arguing, largely on historical and cultural grounds, that Cornwall was a genuinely distinct people deserving formal recognition. The government finally agreed in 2014, and barely a year later, in 2015, geneticists studying grandparents' DNA quietly proved, on a completely different kind of evidence, that they'd been right all along. It's worth being careful about exactly what all of this does and doesn't actually prove. Nobody involved in this research is claiming Cornwall is home to some separate human subspecies, or that there's a single Cornish gene that marks someone out as authentically local. What these studies capture is a statistical snapshot of population history, patterns of who tended to have children with whom, generation after generation, for well over 1,000 years, based specifically on people whose grandparents were all born locally. Modern Cornwall, like everywhere else in Britain, is far more mixed than that snapshot suggests, filled with people who moved there recently, married in from elsewhere, or trace only part of their ancestry back through the county at all, and that's exactly as it should be. What the genetics actually reveal isn't a fixed racial category, it's something closer to a fingerprint left behind by centuries of geography, politics, and trade. A river that slowed down a medieval conquest by a few crucial centuries, a seam of tin in the ground that pulled travellers across an entire continent 4,000 years ago, and a modern political campaign that turned out to be standing on genuinely solid scientific ground even before anyone had run the numbers to prove it. So the next time someone crosses the Tamar, driving from Devon into Cornwall or back the other way, they're doing something that looks, on any ordinary map, like nothing more than passing a county sign. But according to a decade-old genetic study, they're also crossing one of the sharpest population boundaries left anywhere in modern Britain. A line that started as the edge of a Bronze Age tin trade, hardened into a political border under a 10th century king, and somehow survived, quietly written into human DNA, all the way into a university laboratory in 2015. Cornwall spent centuries insisting it was genuinely different. It turns out the proof had been sitting there in its people's genes the entire time, waiting for someone to finally go looking for it.